Welcome to part 2 of the vision pillar in the Dynamic Leadership series. In part 1, we established that having a vision is a prerequisite for building a high-performance environment. We also discussed the challenges that come with pursuing a vision, because by nature, vision is aspirational. That means we'll face obstacles and our employees will not always get it right the first time, especially when they're pushing the boundaries of innovation. One of the biggest traps leaders fall into is treating progress as pass-fail. But when we default to this mindset, we discourage risk-taking and inadvertently suppress the very creativity and effort required to achieve our vision. Struggling at the edge of ability is what drives growth and makes your organization more effective long-term, which is what you need to realize your lofty vision. This is where the distinction between operational excellence and project excellence becomes critical. Operational excellence is about efficiency and consistency, while project excellence is about navigating uncertainty and learning from iteration. Given the speed of external change, innovation is no longer optional. It's a necessary capability of any business that intends to scale. Today, we'll bridge the gap between vision, the aspirational future we're striving toward, and the daily interactions that either reinforce or contradict that vision. Under pressure, it's easy to slip into behaviors that send mixed signals. And we'll examine two specific ways that this happens. One, when leaders make their response equal their reaction, allowing stress or frustration to shape their communication in ways that undermine long-term goals. And the second, when leaders unintentionally shut down enthusiasm for innovation by creating setbacks as failures rather than steps in an iterative learning process. Both of these behaviors affect intrinsic motivation, the internal drive that fuels an employee's engagement and performance. When we get this right, employees feel strong, a sense of ownership, and alignment with the organization's vision. When we get it wrong, they disengage, and over time, they seek environments where their contributions are valued. They may stay in the role, but their heart is somewhere else. Later in this series, we'll explore development plans and structured feedback mechanisms to help your leadership team build the skills needed to stay on track with your vision. Today, we'll focus on simple, actionable ways to ensure your daily leadership interactions support rather than contradict the culture you're building. Now, I'll start with something that probably happens regularly in your communications. And I'll point out that in this series, I'm providing the landscape of dynamic leadership, which I have stated is the ideal leadership style for small businesses seeking to grow and scale. That's important because when you're growing and scaling, each level you hit, and it's going to be different for different organizations, but let's say the difference between $1 million and $3 million in revenue can be a dramatic shift. And then there's another dramatic shift somewhere around 5 or 6 million. Again, it changes because of the amount of outsourcing that you're doing, the amount of artificial intelligence that's involved. But as you think about the spans of control, when you jump another 2 spans, you have a significantly different organization. And spans of control don't just have to do with the employees inside. It also has to do with the virtual teams that you're working with, the contractors, etc. And if you think about it as attention units, it starts to make sense. And I said last week, having a span of control of 8 makes sense, but if you're the owner, you may want to reduce that to something like 5 because you need those other attention units to focus on other areas, whether it's environment, political, administration with the city, state governance, and what have you. It makes sense if you're a small organization like that, hiring the first person on your leadership team earlier than you think you need them. There's always going to be work that they can do. And as we get into the development plans, you'll start to see how that unfolds, that hiring people early is actually not the expense that you might think it is. It actually opens some doors to opportunities. Everything within reason, of course, but we'll get into that later. So in this illustration today, I want to talk about 2 things. The first one has to do with when we are in an interaction with an employee. I use employee, recognize that it could be an independent contractor, it could be a virtual team member. All of these folks that you're hiring you have importance to them because they're getting revenue from you. And depending on how big your slice of their revenue is, it could be just like an employee, even though it's an independent contractor or a virtual team member. But either way, if they are going to be wired to make sure that you're happy. So let's start with an input. And this input can be a person or a situation that happens. That input creates or represents a stimulus for you. And they tell us that we have over 30,000 stimulus response cycles in a day. Paraphrasing a bit there because the actual stat is that we make 33,000 decisions per day. But in keeping with the idea that 95% of our lives are run by habit, you can see that most of those 33,000 decisions, the large majority of them, are stimulus response cycles. And assuming we have about 60 to 65,000 seconds that we're awake every day, that turns into a stimulus response every other second. So I just want to put some context around how could we be making 33,000 decisions in a day? Well, when you're thinking about stimulus response and you consider that the subconscious can process at 11 million bits per second, you get there. This represents a stimulus, and this stimulus is going to create a reaction. As the leader, you have honed your reactions based on experience. In fact, if I'm speaking about your leadership team is in place probably because of their past results and past performance. When you consider reactions are also associations, right? The stimulus response cycle is associations. Associations are largely from the past, which means if you're in innovation mode, many of those reactions will probably not be optimal for the current situation. Said another way, if you're allowing your reaction to equal your response, you're probably creating some resistance. What we want to do is get it so that our input, it will lead to a reaction, but that reaction is just a data point. We're not going to let the reaction equal the response. And this is what happens for most of us. When we say that our lives are run 95% by habit, we're in essence allowing the reaction to equal the response. And when you think about people being triggered, you can see that they are saying and doing things that are out of line with how they really believe or expect to be acting. So what we're going to do is make the shift so that the input, it does cause that reaction, but that reaction is a data point. If you're operating in operating mode, many of those inputs happened before. And I'm talking about an input. It could be there's a problem, somebody asks a question, they make a statement, they share a point of view, whatever that is. In operational mode, this data point probably represents a larger percentage of your data gathering in that moment. And by the way, this whole thing is a half a second. So this is happening very fast. And because the subconscious can process at 11 million bits per second, it works. We can do what I'm talking about here. That reaction is then going to inform our response. We're still talking within that half second. So we're wasting about a quarter of a second by letting the reaction equal the response. I'm not going to say wasting it, but in play, we have cognitive biases, obviously the associations. We say that neurons that fire together wire together. So it's not just the associations that are related to that. It's also the other associations that happen in that same moment, and then other heuristics. So cognitive bias is a heuristic, but also so a meta program. So in other words, neurons that fire together wire together. If it happens over and over and over, you end up with this bundling of associations, and that can become a meta program, which is how we get through the day, because we're not thinking about every single thing. We're leveraging the speed of the subconscious. And what we're going to do is slow this process down, but we're going to do it at this point, and then we'll do it again here. The reason we're doing it this way is because This reaction can happen in less than a quarter of a second. The conscious mind doesn't come online for about a half second. So looking at it like this, the stimulus to reaction is about a quarter of a second. And it could be faster than that for people who are trained, or if you're in a highly stressed state already, high beta, you're probably going to be a lot faster with that. If you're in alpha state, it's going to be slower. But the speed, especially if you're stressed, the speed is going to be faster. And then the conscious mind comes online at a half second. The conscious mind only processes 50 bits per second. So with the subconscious processing at 11 million bits per second, the conscious processing at 50 bits per second, you can see the conscious is completely outgunned. But in innovating, you really want the conscious mind to have a larger say. And we're talking about vision. This is where the vision comes into play, right? You've got to consider the vision. And that's why I talk about we can get away from the vision if we just allow our reaction to be the response. In operational mode, you're probably not hurting yourself much, but when you're talking about innovating, you're creating some problems here. Something I didn't mention is that between reaction and response, sometimes your response will be to do something. Sometimes it will be to delay making a decision. Sometimes it will be to disregard it. It's not important right now. Or maybe you're not even going to deal with it. And sometimes it might be to delegate it. It might be something like, yes, we need to deal with this, but why don't you take it to so-and-so and I'll give them a heads up that you're going to be calling them. Those are 4 Ds. You do it, delay it, disregard it, or delegate it. Any of those can be that response that comes after you do that assessment from the reaction. Remember, the reaction is just a data point. I hope you agree that this is better than having a knee-jerk reaction, which becomes a knee-jerk response based on past associations and not necessarily supportive of your vision. Another thing I'll add is that your subconscious looks at the unfamiliar as risk and danger. And I've said that in earlier ones. You can go back and take a look at how I draw that diagram. And it creates this cognitive dissonance. And because excitement and cognitive dissonance can have the same signature as anxiety, that can trigger some other anxious feelings or some stress. And again, neurons that fire together wire together. So now you're off into this fight or flight just because the person asked you a question. They have an innocent question, a logical question based on where they are in the innovation, and we're going to fight or flight. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to condition in a simple positivity exercise, and that positivity exercise will slow the subconscious down on its looking for danger. If you think about the subconscious, its purpose is to keep us alive long enough to procreate. So obviously it's biased towards looking for risks and danger. But when you're going after your vision, we have to accept some of the unfamiliar. And if that unfamiliar looks like danger, when it shows up, what we want, the subconscious may have that fight or flight. So what we're going to do is condition in a positivity drill. And again, I do it inside this because we've got to get it to where it's a heuristic. By doing it as a heuristic, it's already conditioned. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why people have a hard time breaking habits, is because the habit, what they want, the goal, the desire, is on the conscious mind side, and that doesn't come in till a half second, and that's at 50 bits per second. Meanwhile, the subconscious has a quarter of a second jump on the conscious mind, but also because of the 11 million bits per second of processing, it's got a million or 2 bits of information that it's already thought about. You've got the reticular activating system jumping in there, the neurons that fire together and are now wired together. All of that's coming into play. It's giving your conscious mind what it thinks your conscious mind needs. So we have to shift this. And here's the positivity drill. It's a drill, and I've talked before about muscle memory is not really muscle memory, it's nervous system memory, right? The muscles don't fire on their own. It's a neural pathway that's firing the muscle. Neural pathways fire thoughts. Neural pathways are what we use when we speak. So anything that we're talking about when it comes to habit, you can consider that what we're dealing with neural pathways. And it takes drills to change them. You can't change it with conscious thinking because it's one, it's happening too fast, and two, your conscious mind is not even aware of the stimulus in time, so it's getting bad information. And what's more is that because the neural pathway, that's energy going through there, it has the same signature as energy that's coming from thought. And so it feels like thinking. Well, it's like, gee, I thought it came from my mind. It must make sense. It must be right. So we end up doubling down and we back into and we justify. The reality is, though, it's not really coming from your mind. It's coming from your network of neurons, which are associations. That's the habits from the past. We can get into more on why that is. But if you look up myelin, book Talent Code and Grit by Angela Duckworth, they do a good job of explaining myelin. And that's the basis, understanding that, and then along with synaptogenesis, the basis for understanding neuroplasticity. And if you're building an organization that's moving towards a vision, it stands to reason that the organization is not where it needs to be yet. It's got to develop there. And an organization is a collection of people. And so neuroplasticity needs to be part of your thinking, maybe not at the employee level, but certainly as you as the owner and perhaps some of your leadership team needs to be thinking about change management and how neuroplasticity is involved in getting your organization to where they're going to be. So that's why we talk about drills. And this is important for any habit change, that you want to build that habit with a drill, and then better yet, deep practice. But for now, what we're going to do is 3 times a day and 3 reps per set. So 3 times a day, we're going to do 3 reps. And the purpose is to take the bias away from the subconscious to look for danger. And when it does that, when it looks for danger, remember, it sees everything as a potential Serengeti tiger or a tiger on the Serengeti.